Jonathan and David and their relationship. We know David, a great king of old, a great king who did much good for God. He did many things we can read about in 1 and 2 Samuel, and we see David as someone who we look up to. We think of David, we think of a young man who killed a great giant, a Philistine. And with his sling, he tossed that stone and it hit the Philistine giant and knocked him down. And so Israel was able to conquer the Philistines. So we think of David as someone who is great and mighty in our minds. And indeed he was. But how did he get to that point? He had encouragement along the way. Maybe you're someone that you're older in years, you're more experienced, you're wiser. How did you get to that point? I bet someone encouraged you along the way. And so we're going to be talking about encouragement this morning. I've been encouraged in a lot of things. First of which, I probably never would have tried sushi if someone didn't encourage me. I mean, in my mind, raw fish, why would you want to do that? And then I tried it. We don't have a fellowship meal today. Perhaps if we did, it would be sushi and we'd make you all try it. But some of you like it, some of you don't. That's okay. But I found out, I thought it was weird. I thought, why would you want to do that? Until I tried it and I thought, hey, that's pretty good. It was because of encouragement. I was encouraged to try it. But what about preaching? I never grew up saying, hey, I want to be a preacher. I want to do that. What I did was fall in love with God's Word, and I felt like, how can I keep away from sharing God's Word with other people? And so as I grew more and more in love with it, it was other people that encouraged me. Maybe you should think about this. And I probably never would have walked down that path on my own. My degree was in business and marketing. What does that have to do with the Bible? So I decided to go back to school and to go for a Bible degree. And so I'm thankful for people that have encouraged me along the way. Think about people in your life that have encouraged you. Maybe there are just one or two people that you look back and you say, man, these people really encouraged me to start out on a career path or to be the person you are today. You see, without encouragement, our lives would be much different. We all need encouragement. What we're going to look at today is David and Jonathan and see how great of an encourager Jonathan was to David. And so as we look at this morning, I want you to remember, never underestimate the power of encouragement. It might be something small, a small act of kindness, a small word of encouragement that you might offer to someone. And lo and behold, 10, 15, 20 years later, they look back at it and say, I remember when you encouraged me that day. It's exactly what I needed. And so you can be someone that encourages other people, and you may not even realize the impact that you will have, but we need to be encouragers because we all need encouragement in our life. And so as we look at this topic this morning, we're going to jump right in as we look at, if this will click, there we go. In 1 Samuel chapter 23 is where we're going to spend most of our time. But what we're going to look at in verse 14, and to set the stage, David and Saul are at odds with each other. Saul is the king of Israel, his son is Jonathan, and his son Jonathan is next in line to become king, to take the throne. And yet David is someone that God had chosen to be the next king of Israel, and you can imagine Saul didn't like it. If you're the current king, the last thing you want to hear is, oh, by the way, this is the one that's going to take your place. Saul did not like it. And so what we're going to see is there was encouragement found because they could see God at work. Let's look at verse 14. And David stayed in strongholds in the wilderness and remained in the mountains in the wilderness of Ziph. Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. I think the first thing we see here is in verse 14. Saul had plans. Saul had in mind he's going to find David and destroy him, take him out. That way nobody else can be king except Saul. But what did God do in verse 14? God did not deliver him into his hand. My question to you is, do you see God at work in your life? Sometimes all we see is what we see today. We may not see how an injury maybe brought us to sit on the sidelines, to perhaps be a great coach and help other players develop their skills. We may not see how sickness brought us closer to someone than we've ever been before. We might not even see how death that has separated us from a loved one perhaps helped us to find other friends and other family and perhaps another spouse later in life. There's so many things we don't see except looking at them in hindsight. And so we need to see that God is at work every day in our lives. He was at work in the life of David. In verse 14 it says, God did not deliver him into his hand. Saul is searching for David, wants to destroy him, and yet God was at work in the life of David. And we need to think about seeing God at work in our lives. Do we see God at work in the church today? You know, you think about, did God perform some kind of miracle? That now I've been here 11 years. Can you believe that? I was thinking the other day, somebody asked me at Wednesday, I was down preaching at Lima, and they said, how long have you been at Winsville? Or at Foristell? I said, well, I live in Winsville, been at Foristell 10 years. And I thought, on July 1st, it'll be 11. And I thought, well, today's already July 5th. So I guess it's already been 11 years. You see, do we see God at work in our lives? Do we see God at work within the church here at Foristell? And in our lives in this area, do we see God at work? And we need to see God at work. Here in verse 14, we see God at work in David's life. Now, why do we think God would not be at work in our lives? Do you think God still exists? Do you think God is still at work? And if he is still at work, why wouldn't he be at work in our lives? Working out things, helping us, listening to our prayers, and providing for us. God is still at work. Look at verse 16. We need to see God at work, but also we can be encouraged by seeing God at work, but also we can be encouraged by not being jealous of those around us. Let's look at verse 16. As we're talking about Jonathan and David, look at verse 16. Then Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David in the woods and strengthened his hand in God. Now that's kind of unusual when you read that. Maybe you didn't catch it, but let's put all the players and kind of define them. Saul is the king of Israel. Who is his son? Jonathan. Jonathan is the son of the king, the next one to become the king. And yet what in verse 16 do we see Jonathan doing? Verse 16, Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David in the woods and strengthened his hand in God. You see, what's happening in this event is Jonathan was more concerned about God's plans than his plans. Jonathan was less concerned about him being the next king. You know, if you're the king's son, you probably have a vested interest in who's going to be the next king, right? It seems like Thor and Loki would argue over who's going to be the next king. Those who are the king's sons want to know who's going to be the next king, and there's usually arguing and fighting about who it's going to be. But that's not what we see with Jonathan. He was less concerned about who's going to be the next king and more concerned about what is God's plan, what is God's will. And if it is God's will that David is the next king, then I will support him. You see, Jonathan was more concerned about God's plans than his plans for the future. Go back to chapter 18 of 1 Samuel. Chapter 18 is where we see at the end of chapter 17, we see David killing Goliath, the Philistine. In verse 1 and 2 of chapter 18, we see an instant friendship form. Verse 1. Now when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. You see, this is an instant friendship, and this friendship will last their lifetime. They are friends. Maybe you moved to a certain part of town, and you were sad to let your old friends go, but lo and behold, you moved, and maybe right there on that street or even next door, you found a new friend. And it was like in just one day, you had an instant friend, and that friendship has lasted a lifetime. That's what's happening with Jonathan and David here. They became friends, and their friendship lasted a lifetime. And there were times in their lives where they would become discouraged. David became discouraged and even fearful. But Jonathan was one that encouraged him. As we look back at in chapter 23 and verse 17, back to chapter 23 and verse 17, in this particular event where David is running away from Saul, Jonathan comes to him, he visits him, and in verse 17, Jonathan, he said to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Even my father Saul knows that." You see, when you think of David, he can stand up to a giant Goliath. He can stand up to this Philistine soldier, ready for battle, had defeated many. And here is a young man, untested on the battlefield. Sure, he had shepherded his father's flock and killed a bear and killed a lion, but here is David going against Goliath. And he had the bravery to take down Goliath. But here is David also running from Saul, and he's fearful. So Jonathan is coming to encourage him, and in verse 17 he says, "Do not fear." Why would you say that unless he was fearful? David was discouraged. He was fearful. Jonathan saw that and saw that as an opportunity to encourage him. And yet Jonathan, in verse 17, notice what he says. "You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you." What a moment of humility. What a moment of taking yourself out of the way, listening to God's plan, and willing to not be jealous and allow someone to go ahead of you. That would be hard for me. That would be hard for many of us. And yet that is exactly what we see Jonathan do. He says to David, "Don't worry, don't be afraid. You will be on the throne, and I will support you. I'll be right there next to you." Who was the rightful heir to the throne? It was Jonathan. Can you imagine how hard it would be to say that? "You must increase, I must decrease." Isn't that what John the Baptist said about Jesus? John the Baptist had a great following. Many people were excited to hear John the Baptist preach. Yet when John comes to Jesus, he says exactly that. "He must increase, I must decrease." What a moment of humility. You see, there's no jealousy involved. John wasn't jealous of Jesus. Jonathan wasn't jealous of David. He wanted to see him succeed, and that's what encouragement is all about. I'm going to encourage you. I want you to succeed. I'm going to back you up no matter what it might cost me. You see, jealousy is so very dangerous. As we think about jealousy, let's go back to chapter 18, because we do see jealousy in David's life. Not that it was David being jealous, but we do see jealousy raise its ugly head. Let's look in chapter 18 in verse 6 through 9. Verse 6. "Now it happened as they were coming home when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. And he said, 'They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom?' So Saul eyed David from that day forward." You see, the problem with jealousy is, encouragement is, I'm here for you, I'm backing you up, I want you to succeed. Jealousy is the opposite. I'm not going to back you up. I want you to fall down. I want you to stumble. I want you to lose. The danger with jealousy is if it takes root, it can expand. It can grow into hatred. We have to be careful of jealousy. Saul let jealousy take root in his heart, and it ruined him. He was king, and God tore the kingdom away from him because of the way he began to act. You see, jealousy is dangerous because we can let it take root in our lives. Jealousy also is dangerous because it might expand and grow and turn into physical harm. You know, if you grew up with brothers and sisters, if you have brothers and you're jealous of them, what do? You typically fight over stuff. Jealousy can quickly grow where you get into a physical confrontation. And we see Saul being jealous towards David. Look at chapter 18 and verse 10. It happened on the next day that a distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand, as at other times, but there was a spear in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall, but David escaped his presence twice. Go to chapter 19 and verse 10. This seems to be the second time. Saul also sent messengers to David's house to watch him. Sorry, that's verse 11. Let me go to chapter 19, verse 10. Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he slipped away from Saul's presence, and he drove the spear into the wall. So David fled and escaped that night. What is it with Saul and spears? If you're walking down the road and you see Saul and he's got a spear, watch out. He's thrown it at David twice, but that's not where it ends. His jealousy finds no limit. His jealousy starts with David, but he continues to feed it. He continues to let it grow, and he ends up trying to throw the spear at his own son. Look at chapter 20, verse 32 and 33. And Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, why should he be killed? What has he done? Here is Jonathan defending David, verse 33. And Saul cast a spear at him to kill him, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David. You see what jealousy does? It starts small and it grows so fast. Here Saul is throwing spears at David to try to take his life, and lo and behold, he's throwing a spear at his own son. You know, if we let jealousy take root in our lives, maybe it starts small and it starts against our coworkers and people at school, but lo and behold, we turn on our own family. Be careful of letting jealousy take root. It is so dangerous. Jealousy is dangerous because it can tempt us to do physical harm, and it can tempt us to be spiritually jealous of where other people are. Look at chapter 18 and verse 2. Chapter 18 and verse 12. Now Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Go to chapter 20 and verse 1. Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah and went and said to Jonathan, what have I done? What is my iniquity? What is my sin before your father, that he seeks my life? You see, David had not really done anything to Saul personally. Saul heard these people singing a song. They were praising Saul. He's killed 1,000. He's conquered 1,000. But to David, David has conquered 10,000s. That song made Saul become very jealous. What was it that David did against Saul personally? Nothing. But he fed the jealousy. He let it grow. And as he noticed that God was with David, Saul was jealous. And he was spiritually jealous. God is blessing him more than me. You see, if we feed jealousy, we can let it grow, and we can become spiritually jealous of other people. It seems like he prays and God answers his prayer. I am jealous. It seems like she's teaching this class and that class, and how can God bless her with all this ability and not me? We need to be careful of spiritual jealousy. And sometimes that jealousy can happen for no good reason, other than they're being active, and typically I'm just mad at myself because I'm not active. What had David done to Saul? Nothing. And yet Saul was jealous. So we need to be careful of jealousy. Jealousy is dangerous in chapter 20 as we look at verse 30 and 31 because it can cause us to lash out in anger. We see that with Saul. But look at the words that he's going to say. We might lash out with physical anger, but we might also lash out in our words. Look at verse 30 and 31. Then Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." Look at the words that Saul, the father, is saying to his son Jonathan. To me, that would be very hurtful. If your own father says to you in verse 30, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman," that would be hurtful. You see, the thing with jealousy is it doesn't really stop, does it? It may start small, but if you give it a chance and you let it take root, you'll start saying things that you begin regretting or doing things that you'll regret. We have to be careful with jealousy. And the way to conquer jealousy is to be humble and to focus on encouragement. Be willing to let others succeed. That's where Saul failed. Ultimately, with Saul, it tempted him to give in to sin. Chapter 19 and verse 5, we see about Saul. It says, "For he took his life in his hands and killed the Philistine. And the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood to kill David without a cause?" Here is Jonathan saying this to his father Saul. Why are you jealous? Why are you angry? Why do you want to kill David who's innocent? You are giving in to sin. That's the danger of jealousy. So we can encourage one another as we see others succeed and grow and develop. We can encourage others by not giving in to jealousy. Jealousy is extremely dangerous, and so we need to be mindful of it. As we focus back on chapter 23 of 1 Samuel, we can be encouraged by being humble and by submitting. Look at verse 17 of chapter 23. "And he said to him, 'Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Even my father Saul knows that.'" What do we see Jonathan saying? We see Jonathan being humble. He's encouraging David. He's helping David, and he says, "David, you're going to be the one to be the king." This is how Jonathan was. He was encouraging, and he was helping David to be wise. Look at chapter 18, verse 4 and 5. Chapter 18. "Jonathan took off the robe that was on him, gave it to David with his armor, even his sword, his bow, and his belt." You see, if you're the son of the king, those belong to you. You have fancy garments. It says in verse 4, he gave him his armor, his sword, his bow, his belt. If you're David and you're wearing that around, people are probably going to say, "Hey, that's Jonathan's. What are you doing with it?" Well, Jonathan gave it to me. You see, what is Jonathan doing? He's being humble. He doesn't mind seeing David increase and grow and succeed. He is there to encourage David. He's there to help David be wise. In verse 5, "So David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants." What was Jonathan there to do? Help David, encourage David, and to help him be wise. You see, encouragement is also seen in loyalty. Look at chapter 19, verse 1 and 2. Look at Jonathan and David and their relationship. We see Jonathan being very loyal to David. Verse 1, "Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and said to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted greatly in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, 'My father seeks to kill you, therefore please be on your guard until morning and stay in a secret place and hide.'" Jonathan loved David. They were friends. He wanted to encourage him. We can see his loyalty towards David. Oh, that we would have people that were loyal to us and be good friends like Jonathan is to David. You see, we can encourage people by being loyal to them. Maybe you can't do much financially. You can't be like Jonathan, just give expensive gifts. But can you be loyal? We need to be loyal as friends. And if you're a loyal friend, sometimes that's all someone needs is someone they can call on from time to time that they know will be there to grant them wisdom, to encourage them, to lift them up when they're having a difficult day. And that was Jonathan for David. You see, we can give encouragement in so many ways. Look at chapter 19 and in verse 4 and 5. Jonathan's going to be encouraging David through his words. Verse 4. Thus Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, Let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his works have been very good toward you. For he took his life in his hands and killed the Philistine, and the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood to kill David without a cause? What do you see Jonathan doing with his father? He's encouraging his father by talking good about David. You know, don't you hate it when you walk around a corner and there's kids at school and they're talking about you and it's not good? How does that make you feel? About that big. But when you come upon a conversation and people are talking about you and they're talking about you and encouraging, that builds you up. It helps you to feel like, you know what, that person is a true friend. But a friendship can be broken so quickly when you're talking about other people. And so we need to encourage other people by being careful of the words that we say. Encouragement can be seen in something as simple as the words that we say. Okay, it's gonna move at some point. There we go. Let's look at chapter 20, verse 14 and 15. We can also encourage other people by simply showing kindness. Verse 14 of chapter 20. And you shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I still live, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. This is Jonathan talking to David, and when David passes away, David will still live, and David will show kindness to Jonathan and to his household. There'll be other people, Jonathan's descendants, that David's going to bring into his house and give him part of the king's food. You know, kindness is something that is so simple. We don't have to make it difficult. A kind word doesn't cost you anything. But someone might need help. Well, can you be kind and encourage other people by simply helping? You might see someone in the parking lot carrying all the food and all the stuff that has to come into the church building, and you might say, let me help you with that. That didn't cost you anything extra. It wasn't difficult. You see, kindness can be so easy if we'll just think about it. We need to be encouraged by being active. Chapter 18 and verse 4, look what Jonathan did. He took off the robe that was on him, gave it to David with his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt. Jonathan didn't just say kind words. He was willing to show it in his actions. What kindness can you show someone this week? If we'll put that in our mind, and maybe that's the only takeaway you receive from this lesson today, I will be kind. I will help encourage someone through kindness this week, then that's a win. We can also be encouraged by being humble. Chapter 23 and verse 17, the attitude that Jonathan had was this: David, you'll be the next king. You will sit on the throne, and I will be next to you. That is totally opposite of how most kingdoms work, right? In the Old Testament, Athaliah was a woman, and she wanted to be queen of Israel. And so she killed her son, she killed her grandsons, and only one was hidden away. His name was Joash. But she succeeded in killing all of the king's descendants except Joash that was hidden away, because she wanted to be in charge. She wanted to be the next one on the throne. Athaliah was dangerous because she wanted to make sure she's the next one on the throne. But is that what we see with Jonathan? Did Jonathan say, David looks like he's dangerous. He might be the next king. Let me kill him and take the competition out of the way? No. Jonathan was loving. He was kind. He encouraged David. He was willing to be humble to allow David to succeed if that was God's plan. Are we that type of a person? So today, as we wrap this up and we try to apply this lesson, let us remember how powerful encouragement is. Think about how you got to where you're at today. Someone probably encouraged you along the way. Did you need that encouragement? Did you want that encouragement? Absolutely. You wouldn't be the person you are today without that powerful encouragement you received. So who can you encourage today that might need your words, your kindness, or your action? Encouragement is so powerful, and the opposite is true. Jealousy is so destructive. We have to be careful of our attitude. So think about who you can encourage this week and how you might go about encouraging them. You know, the great thing about Jonathan and David, what a wonderful relationship. What a lot of encouragement. What a beautiful relationship we see between the two of them. But let me ask you this, when you look into your heart today, what do you see? Do you see encouragement or do you see jealousy? Is there someone you're jealous of? Is there more encouragement in your heart or more jealousy because what other people are doing or what other people have? What is in your heart today? And if you look in your heart and you see there's too much jealousy, there's too much anger, too much sin, too much hatred, then we need to deal with that today. Today what you can do is come forward in our invitation song. You can ask for the prayers of the church and get jealousy out of your heart. Put it behind you. And maybe simply you just haven't been encouraging others like you need to. The Lord needs His kingdom to grow. And in order to do it, we need a lot of encouragement to grow and expand and live the way we need to live. And so if you haven't been encouraging others like you're able to do, like you can do, like you have been doing in the past, maybe we need prayers this morning to get back on track. This morning, let me encourage you to live your life for God every day. God's not looking for perfect people. He's looking for people that are willing to walk in the light as He is in the light. And if we'll do that, if we're Christians, the blood of Christ will cleanse us of all sin. So today, do you need encouragement? We're here to help you and to give it to you. Whatever needs you might have, we want to help you today. And I want to remind you to be content with whatever we have, because whatever we have is given from God. And if we look at too much at what other people have, we'll only think about what we don't have. Am I happy for other people and what they have? If there's any way we can encourage you today, let us know as we stand and sing the invitation song.